Woo. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. This is my latest iteration of my research into payment cards, skimmers, shimmers, and how they relate to you all. So to give some background, I'm an app, hardware, and ATM hacker. I'm a computer engineer by my background, and I work out of a home lab in Cincinnati, Ohio. The lab has evolved since this picture was taken, but the cat has stayed the same. I previously worked for IBM X-Force Red, and now I work for Coalfire that I joined last year, but I was at X-Force for around 5 years. So to give some background on what I'm going to be talking about today, we're going to talk about why skimmers are still a problem in 2026, how a skimmer attack works, what detection looks like, and what some of the clients come to us for in finding these devices, and also some of the digital forensics that we perform on the devices. Finally, we'll talk about payment card shimmers and cloning cards, and then briefly cover some attacks against ATMs at the end. I'll also cover some of my journey presenting on these devices, performing research, and so on. So questions for the audience: how many have seen skimmers? These are devices that capture swiped cards. They've been around since the 1990s. They're relatively simple to develop, so it seems like I'm in the right place for this sort of thing. On the contrary, shimmers are devices that steal chip cards payment data. So they started appearing around 2015 in the US on the rollout of EMV, and they're significantly more complex to develop. So has anybody seen shimmers here? A lot less. So my research is mostly focused on point-of-sale Verifone skimmers, as you might see on the left. So I've only seen a handful of shimmers. They're not nearly as common in the US because we still use magnetic stripe. And my research will be talking about physical skimmers rather than something like e-skimming, which is performed online. So to explain why this is such a problem, the FBI estimates that skimmers cause up to $1 billion each year from financial institutions and consumers, but there's significant underreporting that goes on in this space. So the industry group that I'm a part of, that I'll talk more about later, estimates that number to be more around $50 billion each year. So there's actually a big problem with this device, or this form of crime, where skimming disproportionately affects citizens on government benefits in the US because SNAP EBT cards exclusively have magnetic stripe in all states except California at the moment. So these skimming devices mostly affect people who don't have the money to otherwise pay for their groceries. So it's a very low-level form of crime, and as you can see in the bottom left, a lot of people who get caught in these rings of performing skimming operations are specifically targeting SNAP EBT benefit receivers. There's also been a surge in devices post-pandemic with the rise of masks and concealing your face. And it really comes down to old tech in the form of magnetic stripe, allowing skimmers to be a problem. And of course, with a lot of things in the payment industry, the blame gets shifted between the banks, the payment processors, the retailers. Everybody points fingers at each other. And some fraud is accepted as the cost of doing business. So a lot of time retailers aren't as motivated to properly deal with these devices or prevent them. As you can see, the FICO debit card and compromise in 2024 graphic. In the bottom right, they have a sort of pie chart showing bank ATMs versus non-bank ATMs. Non-bank ATMs mostly focusing on point-of-sale devices, so the majority of skimmers are placed on point-of-sale devices nowadays. And there's also a few hotspot states, say in the northeast of the US, Texas, and then California has been historically the worst for skimming crime, which has led to them adding chips to their SNAP EBT cards. So to break down how a skimmer attack works, criminals will target outdated payment terminals that have usually minimal surveillance. They'll install the devices in seconds. So I have a demonstration here. This is a Verifone MX915 payment terminal with a skimmer overlay on it. So it's simply an overlay that fits on top of the device, no wiring needed. They can simply place it on in only a few seconds, and the device is installed and ready to start capturing data. The device will capture swiped cards exclusively in form for skimmers, and then the data will be stored locally, and the criminals will come back periodically, maybe every day or so, to retrieve the data over Bluetooth, and then repeat the cycle where the device will be left installed, they'll cache out again, and as long as the device is installed, they'll come back and keep periodically retrieving that data. And the root of this problem comes down to magnetic stripe. So we have demos in the other room showing how you can see the physical ones and zeros on a magnetic stripe card. So this technology was invented in the late 1960s by IBM. All the data on the magnetic stripe is unencrypted. It's very easily read with low-cost hardware. And it's also, like I mentioned, the primary EBT card payment type. So all the information necessary to perform a swipe transaction is stored on the track 2 of the magnetic stripe card, and track 1 stores the cardholder's name in addition to the payment data. So usually skimmers will capture exclusively track 2 from your payment card. Some devices also capture track 1, which includes your name as well. So to break down how skimmers operate, like I mentioned, they'll capture data, so they'll capture your card number, your expiration, and your PIN with this overlaid PIN pad. So on the overlay, not only is there a magnetic sensor to capture your swiped card, but there's also an additional PIN pad. So when you type in your PIN, it'll also type in the PIN on the reader itself. So that's their method of getting your PIN. The data will be saved and stored locally on a flash chip. The criminals will retrieve that data wirelessly over Bluetooth in the form of point-of-sale skimmers. And depending on the device that they're installed on, they can take many different shapes and sizes. And they are battery operated for point of sale skimmers, so they might last a few weeks to over a month in some devices. The biggest difference between these devices not only is what device they're imitating, but the circuit board used on the back end. And depending on the configuration, they can also capture names, like I mentioned. Some devices need to be woken up with a magnet to broadcast over Bluetooth. So while some devices broadcast constantly, other devices the criminals will need to interact with, pass a magnet over the front. That Bluetooth will turn on for 1 to 2 minutes to allow them to dump the data, and then it will turn back off to save power and go back into a sleep state, though it will still capture cards when it's asleep. So most of my research has been on point of sale devices, but there are also skimmers for ATMs and gas pumps. So gas pumps and ATMs can be overlays like point of sale skimmers. They can also be deep insert or even internal devices. So as you see in the top right, that is a deep insert skimmer that fits completely within the card slot of the ATM. And in conjunction with that, there'll be either a pin pad overlay or a camera to capture victims entering their pins. Same with gas pumps. In the past, we've seen a lot of internal skimmers where some of the serial connection from the card reader is unencrypted. So the criminals will open the housing with a default key. They'll install a device between the two serial connectors, and that device will passively sniff all of the data going across the wire. And like I mentioned, they can either use a pin pad overlay or pinhole cameras to capture pins, depending on the device. So for point of sale devices, these are all some overlay variations that we've seen for Verifone. So the most common one, like I showed before, is this traditional full face or half face overlay, like in the top left picture. There's also been some other devices like the one in the top middle where there's a pin pad overlay and then there's a wraparound on the edge of the device to insert the magnetic sensor from the top. I've seen a two-part device, so a pin pad and a magnetic sensor. And then finally, I've seen a lot of these devices more recently where it's just a pin pad insert and then there'll be a wire that wraps around the front and inserts a sensor in the magnetic swipe slot. So a lot of those different variations can be harder to detect if you're only looking for the most common one. And also important to note, terminals do have anti-tamper features, but simply placing a skimmer on top of them doesn't trigger any of those anti-tamper features. So to spot one for yourself, I do have this setup over on the other table. So if you want to come see this afterwards, then you can play around with it, feel it for yourself. There are a few different indicators of compromise that really give it away once you know what you're looking for. But again, it is dependent on each terminal. So for Verifone terminals, you can see on the right, there is an extra slot added by the skimmer. So that happens when your card swipes through the slot. They add that top slot to look like the real device, but in reality, your card is swiping through that lower slot where the magnetic sensor is placed. Sometimes there's protrusions or alignment issues. Sometimes the terminals might have problems reading cards. There's been reports of criminals deliberately disabling the chip or the contactless on gas pumps to make people swipe their card, though just like a lot of parasites, they like to keep their host alive, so they're incentivized to not mess with the terminal and keep it operational to not arouse suspicion. There are also slight differences from the real terminals, which can be very hard to spot unless you have two next to each other. So for example, on the bottom left, you have very minor differences between the printing on the chip insert slot. So of course, some suspicion is healthy. I always like to tug on the readers, but skimmers on gas pumps and ATMs can be much harder to detect because they can be completely internal. So don't swipe your card is what I'll say. There are a variety of skimmer detection tools that can find these devices. There are some devices like the Hunter Cat and the Skim Scan at the top that operate on the principle that a normal terminal should only have one magnetic sensor capturing your card, one or two depending on the device. So they are looking for the presence of multiple magnetic sensor read heads. So if they detect that inductance from passing by the read head, they'll raise an alert and say, hey, there's potentially a skimmer installed. A lot of organizations use security tape, though criminals have oftentimes bought the exact same security tape, or they simply lift it up and place it back on, so that's not a very sound solution. The Target Easy Sweep is one of the most common methods that organizations use to find these devices. It's a little 3D printed or injection molded clamshell that Target will provide the CAD file for free to retailers and banks. And what this allows them to do is to insert into the chip slot of a point of sale terminal. And when there's a skimmer overlay installed, it doesn't fit in, but when there's no overlay installed, it fits in over top the chip insert slot. So this is a very cheap, affordable, mass-producible way to find devices that also doesn't require a lot of training, because if you think about the scale of a lot of retail organizations, you can't expect them to buy multi-hundred-dollar detection devices at every single one of their stores. So teaching an employee how to use this only takes a few seconds versus some electronic device. There are a lot of Bluetooth detection tools, though these can be less reliable due to the fact that not all skimmers broadcast over Bluetooth constantly. So if you're looking for a device that's asleep, then you're not going to find it. The commercial ones might not have a full data set. Law enforcement has their own internal tools that have more up-to-date data sets than some of the apps that you'll see online. They like to keep it closed down. And then finally, there's a device known as the Skim Buster now that's more technically advanced, where it's actually looking for the characteristics of what a legitimate terminal swipe will look for, and then they can compare that against what a skimmer swipe looks for. And that's developed as a part of SAPTA, some of the skimming group that I'm in. So that one's one of the newest devices. Really, it comes down to training your employees on how to find them and doing daily or twice daily checks to remove them. Some terminal security stands that hold onto the terminal will grab the terminal in ways that will prevent overlays from being installed. So that can also be a preventative measure to also help deter criminals from installing devices. So with point of sale skimmers come numerous different circuit boards. We've gotten to the point where I can't fit them all in one slide anymore. There's a few similarities between these families of devices where they'll use the same microcontroller between devices. So there's indicators that the same criminal organization will be making different iterations of devices. Different circuit board variations have different storage formats. Some do plain text. We've mostly seen that been phased out. Most do some form of encoding, and nowadays almost all of them are encrypting the data at rest, stored on the flash memory. All point of sale devices that I've seen use Bluetooth to retrieve data. It's also very difficult to tell where these devices are made. Traditionally, from the intelligence reports I've heard, it's a lot of Romanian nationals, but Romania has started to crack down on the skimming gangs, so a lot of them have moved to China. China doesn't necessarily care if you make criminal devices as long as you don't use them in China, so they're exported and sent to the US in the form of circuit boards. We've been able to recover cards from multiple variations using a variety of techniques, whether that be chip off or exfiltrating the data over Bluetooth, which I'll get into. So again, this is a second slide of more devices. We ran out of Greek letters to call them phi, so we've started to resort to other ones. Like if you see, we have Batman and the Flash, where the criminals will imprint a logo on them, or we have Robin, which uses a similar microcontroller. We've jumped down the rabbit hole. Too many at this point. So to talk about some of our client objectives, there's a variety of different retail clients and how they treat skimmers and these devices. A lot of the ones that you'll see on social media are the out of sight, out of mind, where they do zero due diligence to prevent these devices from being installed. And when they are found, say in a gas station, the employee will act completely surprised that there was a skimmer installed and say, "Oh, don't touch that, give me that," or something like that. There's also the family of law enforcement will handle it, where every device that they find simply goes to law enforcement. There's no follow-up on that, and they basically forget about it after it leaves their hands. In the middle, we have some compliance-focused vendors where they're very much focused on the legal aspect to gather the data to disclose data breaches, but they often don't report stolen card numbers. They're just reporting whatever's necessary to disclose their data breach. There are also best practice vendors where they're saying, how can we find these devices faster and how can we get into preventing them? Because again, you have to think about retailers and the devices that these skimmers are installed in. It doesn't directly affect the retailer. The money being stolen is coming from the victims of the swiped cards. The retailers are sort of a byproduct of being in the middle where the devices are installed. Finally, you have the catch the criminals, by all means necessary vendors who are part of the sort of leading industry groups that do all that they can to compile the evidence, chase the bad guys, and work hand in hand with law enforcement. So this is a map that I've made of some of the different device variations. At this point, this data set is from a year or two ago, so it's not current, but you still get this idea of some criminal organizations use one type of device, say on the East Coast versus the West Coast. And of course, this is biased towards some of the retailers that we've worked with and anonymized the data for. So this isn't representative of the latest threats or all the places in the US where these devices are located. So again, clients are oftentimes looking to recover the data and determine what form of data is captured, potentially identify attackers if possible, and reduce time to detection. So what we've seen is if you're able to find these devices soon after they're installed and remove them, then the criminals are less likely to install them again because they don't get that return on investment when the device is only installed for a few hours, when they might be paying hundreds of dollars for one device. And when it's removed immediately, there's no justification for them to keep installing them in your store. So moving on to the digital forensics aspect of my research, there's a few commonalities between different device variations. The captured data will be stored on an external SPI flash memory chip. So that's this really tiny chip in the middle left. Like I mentioned, it's either encoded or encrypted. Then you also have the firmware or the code of the device. It's stored within the microcontroller. So this is the big multi-sided chip in the middle. And importantly, it's compiled into machine code, so you don't get the original source code or the comments of the device if you are able to extract that firmware. Finally, one of the most important pieces of evidence for law enforcement is last paired MAC addresses, where in order to tie that criminal case to a specific suspect, if you have that MAC address that's stored in the skimmer saying that's their phone that they paired to, then that can be the nail in the coffin for them in law enforcement investigation. So to do data extraction, one of the most common methods is to do chip-off data extraction, where we'll physically desolder the flash memory chip. We'll mount it onto a breakout board and solder leads to it to speak directly to it. Some flash memory chips might have exposed leads that you're able to clip onto, but in the case of skimmers, the circuit boards are so tiny that it uses a package type that doesn't have exposed leads, and you must basically desolder them and solder them onto a breakout board. So this can be quite a pain in the ass because of how tiny these chips are. That is a grain of rice on the right side next to that chip. So to get consistently 8 good solder connections on those pins for dozens of devices is quite a challenge. And you have to consider the package type, the protocol, and the pinout of the chip to be successful. So once we've dumped the data from the flash memory chip, this is one of the sort of more common data storage formats. So this data is stored unencrypted. The memory chips range from 2 megabytes to 8 megabytes, and the cards are stored in 256 byte pages. So one 2 megabyte memory chip could store 8,000 cards in one device. Traditionally, we've seen anywhere from 100 to a few hundred cards on one skimmer. It depends on how long it was installed. Additionally, criminals can wipe the memory of the device when they pair to it, so it's hard to know if there's been even more. I think the most that I've seen is around 1,000 cards on one device, and the least I've seen is maybe just a few if the device was removed soon after it was installed. So they use this character walk to sort of store the data, and then at parts in the data where you see that redaction is where they've XORed the data onto the character walk, and they have different sections where they store the PIN and the expiration date. So moving on to the actual reverse engineering of the microcontrollers and the firmware, this gets very complicated because there's so many different families of microcontrollers that they use. Each one speaks a different protocol. There's different common chips that they use. Some devices are unlocked, some are locked, some can be unlocked or locked depending on just which device you have. And of course, every single different protocol means that you need a different device to speak it. So it becomes a very slippery slope of having a giant lab full of random programmers just to be able to communicate with some of these devices. So this will be on the test. Make sure you write this down. So this is me performing firmware extraction from one of the EFM32 devices, that family of microcontroller. So on the left, you see pictures of me using what's called PC byte probes to hook on to the 2 pins required to speak the serial wire debugging protocol. So the criminals have made it easy on the top board where they've had the 2 debugging pins broken out to test pads. So all I have to do is put my pins onto the test pads and I can interface with the chip. On some of the newer devices, they've removed those test pads in favor of little micro connectors that you clip onto the board for them to charge the device or to program it or dump the data. So that I have exploited in that case. I found the pins on that connector that are responsible for speaking SWD, and I've probed directly onto them with my PC bytes. On the right, I have the output from OpenOCD with some specific configuration files for my programmer and for the specific microcontroller that I'm trying to read from. And if the device is unlocked, it will dump a bin file of the full firmware. So this only works if the microcontroller is unlocked. If the criminals decide to set a lock bit when they're programming the device, then you're not able to easily retrieve the firmware from it without something like fault injection. So once we have a bin file of the firmware, we can get into reverse engineering. So I've used Ghidra for this. You can also use Aidan. There is a very useful plugin in Ghidra called, oh geez, now I'm forgetting it. But SVD loader, that's what it is. So with these microcontrollers, a lot of the peripheral interfaces are mapped to points in memory, so a memory map peripheral. And when you load a bin file in Ghidra, it won't know what those RAM addresses are pointing to. So SVD loader is a plugin that allows you to take system view description file for that microcontroller, load it in Ghidra, and then that file will tell Ghidra where all the specific memory mapped peripherals are. So when the device is referencing UART, you can see that memory address and it will tell you, hey, this is going to the UART peripheral. So that makes reverse engineering a lot easier when you know where a function is pointing to. Like I mentioned, the firmware is compiled into machine code, so decompilation is very imperfect and messy. Nowadays, with the rise of large language models, it has become exponentially easier to perform reverse engineering on these compiled binaries, with LLMs able to very easily read the machine code that humans aren't very good at reading. At least I'm not. So one of the easiest things to do on a lot of these devices is find the useful strings to trace in the firmware file. So on the right, you have the strings that are found in the firmware file. You can also just get this from running strings on the firmware dump. So the top value, it might be tiny to see. There's a numeric pin that's required. Once you pair to the device, you need to enter that pin in the Bluetooth serial terminal for the device to unlock. Then you have some commands that can be run within the device to then dump the data or set the time, erase the data, stuff like that. So once we have the right pin from the firmware and the right commands to run, a lot of these devices use simple Bluetooth serial terminals, so you can connect to them on a phone like the criminals would with a Bluetooth serial terminal app. So on the left, I have the output from connecting to one of these devices, entering the password, it responds with pass OK, running the flash command, it tells me some stuff about the flash chip. And then finally, if you run the alive command, it says get rich or die trying. So there's some 50-cent inspiration in some of these criminal organizations. But once you run the dump command on the right, it will spit out all of its records that it's captured with a record code, the PIN number, the time it was captured, which can be very inaccurate, and then finally an encrypted data blob for the criminals to use. So importantly, this is not the end of the chain. A lot of these organizations require you to then send this dumped data off to another criminal for them to decrypt and send you the information back. So they build this form of reliance on them where you might buy the device from them, but you still have to rely on them to decrypt the data. But of course, it's just symmetric encryption, so that encryption key is also stored in the firmware. So with the firmware, we can retrieve that and then decrypt this data. Moving on to another form of malicious payment devices, Shimmers are devices that steal payment card chip information, so inserted chip information, versus Skimmers are swiped cards. So Shimmers operate on the principle that they shim between a card and the reader. So they sit between your card, your inserted chip card, and the reader. They'll be powered by the reader, and they'll also steal that magnetic stripe data from the chip. So you might be saying, well, aren't EMV chips secure? They use one-time values to perform transactions. That is all true. The transaction that you make when using a chip uses tokenized values to use one-time values. But additionally, your chip still stores what's called magnetic stripe equivalent data. So in that equivalent data, it functionally stores a copy of the data on the magnetic stripe that skimmers steal. So you'll have your primary account number, your expiration date, your name, and a CVV that should be different from the one on the skimmer. So in a way, it's very similar to a skimmer attack where they're stealing a similar form of data. They're not cloning your chip. They're not stealing that private key stored within the chip. And these devices, because they're only powered when a card is inserted, the data is retrieved via a special card that gets inserted into the device. And it's clever. Some of the devices that we've seen use the unused pins on the chip as their pins to dump the device. So normal EMV chips might only use 6 pins or not the full 8. So the criminals will use those unused 2 pins to have their special card talk to their device and retrieve the data. So in the bottom right, you can see this is actually a LumaField X-ray scan of one of the Shimmers that I have. So that printout is over there if you'd like to look at it up close. But I like to see, so you can see the microcontroller and some of the wire leads and the traces on the board. It's very cool. So moving on to how EMV chip cards work. EMV, if you're not familiar, is Europay, Visa, and MasterCard. So this standard came about in the mid-1990s when skimmers were such a big problem and the industry was tasked with trying to solve this problem. There's 2 main types. There's chip and PIN, and there's chip and signature. Credit cards in the US use chip and signature, so they're supposedly verifying your signature, though, yeah, they're not. Chip and PIN is more common overseas. It's used basically exclusively in Europe where you're forced to enter your PIN. There's also debit cards in the US commonly use chip and PIN, though if you've ever been asked to run your debit card as credit, it's using that as chip and signature. So you can still run your debit card as chip and signature rather than chip and PIN. And of course, there's what's called cardholder verification methods, where it's sort of like a hierarchy of what's the most secure method. The card and the terminal will agree on the most secure method that both support. But criminals can exploit this with cloned DMV cards to downgrade that cardholder verification method to something like signature that's more insecure. So older chip cards just use static data for authentication versus basically all new chip cards use crypto processors with dynamic data to form that one-time transaction value. And of course, within the payment processor landscape, with different point of sales, different ATM systems, different backends, there's a lot of misconfigurations that could arouse for vulnerabilities in this process. And importantly, the chip is also used in contactless transactions. So if you ever contact your card to do tap to pay, that's using the cryptographic module stored within the chip. So just like I mentioned that you can retrieve the track2 equivalent data or magnetic stripe equivalent data from the chip, you can also do that with contactless. So yes, tap to pay is secure. No, your chip is not secure is what I'll say. So going into how criminals use stolen cards, the data stolen from a skimmer is all the data required to clone a physical magnetic stripe card. So the criminals will use a reader like this, there's some of these around, that will be able to write a blank magnetic stripe card with the data stolen from a skimmer. Once they've written that card, they can either withdraw it from withdraw cash from ATMs. Another very common attack vector we've seen is criminals going to gas pumps with hundreds of cards and a specialized diesel tanker truck, and they'll spend an hour at a pump using card after card to buy large amounts of diesel fuel, and then they'll go and resell that diesel fuel as a way of cleaning the cash very easily. There's a lot of sketchy gas stations that are willing to buy gray market diesel without paying the federal fuel tax. So criminals can also make cloned EMV chip cards that can pass offline verification, not online verification. Most terminals that you see nowadays are online, so they are doing a handshake on a backend server to verify that your card's actually legitimate. Though if there are offline terminals, then they can be fooled by static data authentication cloned cards. So to read cards, there's a few different sort of adapters that we can use. There's contact adapters, contactless, and then of course, like I mentioned, contactless readers. So we have a few in the village if you'd like to see. Importantly, the data on the chip can be read without verifying the PIN. There's also offline PIN verification. So all this data to get the track2, track1 equivalent data, you don't have to enter a PIN to read. So like I mentioned, the EMV chips will hold that magnetic stripe equivalent data. The actual card number will be the same in the data, but they're supposed to use a different verification code in the magnetic stripe and the magnetic stripe equivalent data in the chip. It used to be that vendors use the same three-digit code in the data. Nowadays, they should be using a different one, though allegedly some payment processors don't verify that data. So if you have dumps from a shimmer, you might still be able to use that on a cloned magnetic stripe card or in a sort of online transaction if you're able to somehow brute force the three-digit value on the back of the card. So to clone cards, criminals will often use what's called magnetic stripe fallback. Some terminals nowadays don't want you to swipe your card if it has a chip. So there's data on the magnetic stripe to say, hey, I am a chip-enabled card. And the terminal might say, don't swipe your card, insert your card. Well, when you create a cloned magnetic stripe card, you have all the power to just change that value to say, I am just a magnetic stripe card, let me swipe my card. Like I mentioned, offline terminals can be fooled by EMV clones. So within some of the law enforcement groups I've been, they've confiscated laptops of criminals who have some card cloning software on them, like the X2 EMV software shown there. Some criminals will make the terminal deliberately misread the chip to make them swipe their card. And of course, with fraud liability in the US, I think it was in 2013 or 2014, where the liability now falls on whoever enables the magnetic stripe transaction to exist. So there's a lot of finger pointing to say, no, you were the one that let me swipe your card or however such. And of course, the card security codes are not always verified. So moving into the sort of law enforcement and retail partnerships, there's a group called SAPTA, which is the Skimming and Payment Terminal Attack Group. This is a public-private sector partnership between law enforcement, retailers, banks. Somehow I've ended up in the group. I'm kind of the anomaly to not be any of those. It's a part of the IAFCI, International Association of Financial Crimes Investigators. So this is a group where members from the Secret Service, local law enforcement, retailers, and banks will get together, share the latest threats, and sort of collaborate on working together to fight the same devices that everybody is seeing. So there'll be reports sent in to an email chain of specific incidents. Say somebody is investigating one criminal targeting one bank, there might also be an investigation going on somewhere else. So it's good to see collaboration between the different organizations. Though if I've learned anything from working with law enforcement, they act like they're on completely separate teams at times. So it's been eye-opening to say the least. So the picture on the right is Kroger's skimmer analyst and I presenting at the last SAPTA meeting in November. We presented on some of the latest analysis techniques that we use to reverse engineer the devices. We also had a skimmer database, I think, poster that's somewhere around here that categorizes a lot of the latest devices. Within SAPTA, so SAPTA is maybe 1,000 plus member group. Within SAPTA, there's a smaller subgroup called SAPTA Tech, which is focused on the technical members that do the investigations, dump the data, and do the reverse engineering. So that's where I come in. I sit within SAPTA Tech to be one of the people that helps law enforcement and retailers coordinate their investigations and work on the latest techniques to retrieve the data, retrieve the firmware, and dump the data over Bluetooth. So we're sharing information about the latest threats and cooperating to the fullest extent to catch the criminals and work together. So the picture on the left is me at the first SAPTA Tech meeting last year, where I was able to knock the socks off of all the law enforcement, because law enforcement are often hackers fourth or fifth. They're not hackers first. They have a lot of different hats to wear. So when I came in and presented the technical research, they were like, whoa. So there's a lot of different devices that you see on the right. I think there's a poster where you can see them somewhere in here. So over the past few years, I've gone through a lot of different sort of conferences, customers, retailers that I've worked with to get to this point. I first looked at skimmers in 2023, actually, with a forensic analysis of a card shimmer, which completely was out of my ballpark of sort of knowledge, and that was an eye-opening experience. I eventually fell into the work of repeat customers, where multiple retailers would come back to us to have us investigate more devices. Eventually, that led me to asking the hard questions to say, how can I take this further beyond just retrieving the data, but retrieving the firmware and doing reverse engineering on the device? So that led to presenting at the Food Industry Association's Asset Protection and Grocery Resilience Conference. I then spoke at Hardware.io last year on the technical details, so that talk is available on YouTube if you'd like to watch. Finally, as I mentioned, I spoke with Kroger at the last annual SAPTA group meeting, and I released several blog posts for Colfer at the end of last year. There's also another event upcoming at the Secret Service headquarters in November this year, where I'll be presenting with Kroger again. And again, I don't have a PCI background, so this is all my experience sort of stumbling my way through these devices. So it's a very, I would say, closed-minded perspective of the industry works in very different ways when you actually know a lot more about how the industry operates. So finally, one of the things that we've turned towards within my research is, as skimmers have become more of a research effort than formal work, we do a lot of ATM pen tests now. So one of the attacks that we've seen come into SAPTA, because SAPTA also reports on crimes against ATMs, are what's called direct memory access attacks. So I have a demo box that I've built in the other room if you'd like to see this attack demonstrated afterwards. This is one of the top ATM jackpotting attack that occurs now. So what criminals will do is they'll perform reconnaissance. A lot of ATMs use shared default keys. So they'll open an ATM, they'll install a malicious device, and then finally they'll come back later to cash out. And this is oftentimes done in specific stages. So they might go to ATM A and do some recon, check what PC it uses, check what attacks might work on it. They'll leave, go to another ATM a week later, install their device on that ATM, and then leave again. If nobody comes and removes the device, then a week after that, somebody else will come down and actually have the ATM spit out all its cash. So this is more of an attack vector to install malware on the ATM. So what happens is they'll install a PCIe DMA card. It can be PCIe, it can be M.2, Thunderbolt. There's multiple different hardware interfaces that support direct memory access. It's an intended hardware feature. And then after they've installed that card, they'll send commands to it over USB, say with a Raspberry Pi, to run arbitrary code on the machine once you've mounted all the virtual memory. Because once you have full read-write access to a system's memory, you have access to everything on the system. You can do whatever you want. So this is not a new attack. Ulf Frisk did a DEF CON talk a decade ago now on this attack, but it's only been in the past few years that criminals have actually started using this against ATMs to jackpot them. So looking ahead, as I mentioned, there's another SAPTA meeting at the Secret Service headquarters in a few months. Within SAPTA, it's a very good threat intelligence group to be in if you're a member of the payment space. So I encourage you, if you are in the space, to join with your organization so you can get a sense of what the latest attacks are. So within SAPTA, we're able to use the threat intelligence to target vulnerabilities to test for on ATM pen tests like direct memory access. Then finally, a lot of modern day skimmers have locked their microcontrollers, so we can no longer do just straight firmware extraction like on unlocked devices. So the next sort of realm to me, for me to dive into is to glitch skimmers with fault injection techniques. So maybe if I get that to working, that'll be a main stage talk, but only one way to find out. So some closing thoughts. It's definitely a multifaceted problem with a lot of different aspects to solve it. In the end, magnetic stripe is the problem. Chip and contactless is the solution, though that does come with asterisks with the form of magnetic stripe equivalent data still being stored on them. And what we've seen with a lot of retailers is if you're able to detect the devices quickly, then the criminals are less likely to install the devices in your stores. So quick detection leads to prevention in a way. For some homework, have healthy suspicion whenever you're paying for items. Compare the adjacent terminals and always use cash, chip, or contactless. The most secure form of payment is definitely either cash or a contactless digital wallet like Apple Pay or Google Pay, which use one-time tokenized values for each transaction. There are attacks using Apple Pay and Google Pay, which I won't get into here, but attacks such as NFC relay exploit the fact that your card could be added to an Apple Pay or Google Pay wallet, and then that transaction can be relayed to anywhere in the world to then spend that. So talk for another day if you're interested in me talking about that. There's a lot of people who helped me get here. Adam Laurie from Alpatronic, I think, is doing EV charging hacking. You might know him by Major Malfunction. David Byrne is in the back of the room, who's one of my mentors. John Hoops might also be in the room, who's with IBM X-Force Red. Jonathan Buffington from Kroger. Daniel Cuthbert with Santander here somewhere. SAPTA Tech, of course, and there's a lot of unnamed retail partners that wish to remain anonymous but contribute greatly in providing their devices or helping with research techniques. Then finally, the Payment Village for allowing me to speak and present my research. I have a lot of pictures around the room and in the other room. If you care to look at some of the pictures up close or the devices hands-on, feel free to come to the next room afterwards and I'll show off my devices. Thank you all for listening.